Sure. Representative Park, thank you so much for joining me today as a part of AYCE's interview series. So before we jump into the questions, could you just introduce yourself and give a little bit about your background in politics?
Sure. So first, thank you so much for having me. I know it took a little while for us to find some time, so thank you for your flexibility and patience. My name is Sam Park. I'm a Georgia State Representative. I'm the first Asian American Democrat ever elected, as well as the first openly gay man elected to our state legislature. I've been in office for about 7 years now. I was first elected in 2016. So now I've become the first or the longest serving Asian American in the Georgia State Legislature. And recently I was elected as the first Asian American to serve in a leadership position in either chamber or either party, where I currently serve as the whip of the Georgia House Democratic Caucus today.
Wow, that's amazing, Representative Park. So I want to begin by talking a little bit about your background and your motivation for entering politics. So first, could you just share a little about your background and your AAPI heritage?
Sure. So I'm Korean American. I was born and raised in the state of Georgia. And I think like a lot of low-income immigrants, certainly for myself, I never saw myself running for office or, and growing up, I don't think I was really politically engaged. Oftentimes, I heard from my parents, keep your head down, work hard, stay out of trouble. Certainly don't get into good trouble or again, getting involved, running for office really wasn't ever on the radar for me. I think when I was in law school, that began to change as I became very fascinated with public policy, in which really that was an opportunity in which we would see a shared problem or a systemic issue in which we would come together from all different backgrounds and experiences to try and solve that same problem, which is ultimately what the legislative process to kind of create public policy is about. And so being very interested in public policy, I decided that rather than go a traditional route from law school, I wanted to lean in and learn more about public policy. So I got my master's in law, politics, and legislation. But never in my wildest dreams did I think that I would be a candidate myself. For me at the time, my dream job was to be a policy director. But what compelled me to run for office was the hardship that my mother and family faced. Back in 2014, my mother was diagnosed with terminal cancer, and it was public health insurance, Medicaid and Medicare, that gave her a fighting chance. And so through those difficult circumstances, the big policy issue suddenly became personal. And when it became personal, that became the impetus for me to run for office. I challenged a 3-term Republican incumbent in 2016 and ended up unseating her and making history the very same night that Donald Trump became president of the United States, which was a very surreal experience. But it all goes to show that, especially as an Asian American born and raised in this country, despite the lack of experience, our democracy is still vibrant and it is still responsive to change, in which, when we feel inclined or compelled to use what power we have as citizens, we can make an incredible and powerful difference even today.
Yeah, no, and I think it's so inspiring to see how, even though it's not something you ever visualize for yourself, how your background, like how your experiences in law school really fed into going into these different policy areas and attacking them and really trying to preserve our democracy at its core despite the political and social climate of today. So that
Exactly.
kind of feeds on to my next question, really building off of your early experiences. And I think you touched a little bit about this too. Growing up, what were the attitudes about Asian American civic engagement like? And how accessible do you think civic engagement resources were in your childhood?
So I think up until recently, probably up until, I think even my own election in 2016, at least in the state of Georgia, there was an understanding that Asian Americans did not vote. Because we did not vote, there was no real engagement or investment to turn out Asian American voters. And so then it became this cycle in which there was no investment in turning out Asian American voters. And even if there was, the community was so small that it really wouldn't, make a difference. And because it was so expensive in trying to turn out this brand new community, again, yet another reason for a lack of investment, which led to lower civic participation rates, which fed that cycle of the community is too small and it's too expensive to invest to try and turn them out. So there wasn't a lot of political engagement. Certainly growing up as a kid, going back to like the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, um, until recently, I think. I think the first real effort that I saw to engage and turn out Asian Americans statewide here in Georgia, in a deep southern state, was Stacey Abrams' 2018 campaign, in which I think for the first time we saw a increase in political participation amongst Asian Americans across the board. That kind of long-term investment that wasn't just from one election cycle, but that also came from supporting Asian American civic organizations that focused on getting folks registered to vote and increasing civic participation rates, ultimately had a huge impact in the 2020 election, where in the state of Georgia, we hit a historic high in Asian American political participation, given how the Asian American electorate voted in that cycle based on exit polling and other information we were able to obtain. The Asian American community really became that margin of victory in the state of Georgia, where President Biden won the state for the first time a Democrat winning for the first time in decades by 11, 12,000 votes. And so despite the lack of investment that we've seen historically, again, the Asian American electorate, especially as it's growing, especially given our own diversity, there's an incredible amount of political power inherent in our community, which if we utilize, we've seen that we can change the course of the state of Georgia and also this country.
Right. No, I think that's really important to point out, especially since the last election cycle, we saw Asian American voter turnout almost expand exponentially or almost double. It's really good to see that we're at least trying to prioritize the accessibility of civic engagement resources for historically denied Asian American communities. So now I want to talk a little bit more about your experience as an Asian American in politics. So specifically, as you mentioned, being the first Asian American Democrat to ever be elected to the Georgia State Legislature, what are some barriers in politics you faced, if any?
I think the initial barrier was one of self-doubt. I mean, on one hand, I grew up, born and raised in Georgia. I found myself oftentimes being the only Asian American person in the room. And so in 2016, after I was elected, and January 2017 was the first time that I served, to find myself as the only Asian American in a room of 180 people wasn't atypical. It was an experience that I was accustomed to, again, given my lifelong experience as an Asian American born and raised in the Deep South. And oddly enough, I found myself sitting on the House floor during that very first week that I was in office, feeling like I was exactly where I needed to be. I felt like I belonged there, even though I stuck out as the only Asian American in the room. That said, politics, especially legislative politics, a lot of it is a matter of coalition building. And so, it's coalition building is necessary in order to achieve your majority, because ultimately it is a majority that governs per the rules of the House. We have 180 members in the Georgia House of Representatives. You need 91 votes to pass anything. You need 91 votes or to keep them under that threshold in order to kill any piece of legislation. For me, I was one out of 180, right? I was a 66th Democrat, but there was no one else who I could initially see, especially given how racially polarized politics can be in the Deep South, in which, you had white folks, Black folks, one Asian American, and maybe like one or two Hispanic members of the legislature. That provided or caused some initial barriers and hurdles, especially where, again, it's a majority that governs in terms of trying to obtain that majority. But what I've learned along the way is that even though, again, going back to perhaps the biggest challenge really being internal as opposed to external, the fact that I did not necessarily belong to any of the established groups or the established factions in the legislature, that gave me an opportunity to be more successful and in building the kind of coalitions necessary to either pass legislation or to kill legislation. And so all of that to say, I think because I demonstrated that, as the first Asian American, and first Asian American Democrat in the legislature, I was there to serve, and I was there, and that I cared about the state of Georgia just as much as folks who may have lived in the state for, 5 generations or 10 generations. I think part of that was to help pave the way for more Asian Americans to, you know, seek office and to win as well. And so today, 7 years later, we have one of the largest Asian American caucuses in the country, which again is fantastic and speaks to the importance of not just coalition building, but also paving the way once you break those barriers for the next generation.
Right. And I think, especially since you mentioned the Georgia Legislative API caucus, I think that's a really big step towards increasing Asian American civic engagement in Georgia. So, could you also tell us a little bit more about the caucus and what its next steps are?
Absolutely. So we've had kind of an informal caucus for a few years now. Before it was just 5 of us, myself, Representative B. Wynn, who ran for Secretary of State, Michelle Au, who's the first Asian American state senator, Sheikh Rahman, first Muslim American elected to the Georgia State Legislature, and Marvin Lim, first Filipino American. All of us are history makers in our own right, which is fantastic, but also is an indication of how much work we still have to go if we are the ones who are beginning to make those inroads. We've never elected an Indian American to this Georgia State Legislature, for example. We just elected the first Pakistani American just last year, and we just elected the first Muslim American woman, Rua Roman, to the State House last year. And so again, a lot of work remains to be done, but as a starting point, I think by being in office, it's hopefully to send a signal to our communities and others who are other immigrant communities who are watching us that our government is accessible, right? That if we can do it, they too can do it, and that representation is absolutely important. Representation matters, especially in a representative democracy. As our population and demographics change, so too should our elected leaders, especially if our representative democracy is being reflective of and responsive to those population changes. From a policy perspective, really a lot of the work that we initially started to do came about as a result of in response to the March 16th shooting that happened a few years ago. And so our primary policy focus at the time was to make sure was focused in and around gun safety and multilingual access when it comes to public safety. So on the House side and the Senate side, for example, we introduced legislation to impose a waiting period before you could purchase a gun. That was, I think, either 3 days or 5 days. That cooling off period, when we've seen that implemented in other states, resulted in a reduction in gun violence, whether through homicides or by suicides. Certainly, in a moment, I think it subsided a little bit, but even now, where we're experiencing elevated levels of discrimination and fear and violence toward Asian Americans around the country, again, ensuring their public safety, which is really a fundamental aspect of civil society and the purpose of having government, resulted in that gun safety piece of legislation being a top priority. It still is. And Representative Michelle Au is still doing a lot of, is leading a lot on the gun violence issues. Currently, the primary bill that she's working on is a pediatric safe storage law, especially in light of the horrific statistic that gun violence is the #1 cause of death of American children and teens, which is unacceptable. Gun violence and protecting our community aside, access to public services, and trying to expand access to the ballot box through multilingual services is also, I should say, remains a top priority as well.
No, and I think it's really good to see all the work that you're able to do, especially with your colleagues like Michelle Au, and really just being pioneers in Georgia government in the Deep South, where we haven't seen historically Asian American representation. And especially when we saw events like the March 16th shooting happen directly in Georgia, it's really important to see how our elected officials are working towards combating those issues and those injustices we see. So that brings me a little more to the next section I want to talk about, which is really what your projects are and your future goals for the Asian American community. So, specifically from the plethora of legislation that you've co sponsored and authored, which do you believe have had the greatest impact on the Asian American community?
Which issue do I believe has had the greatest impact?
Like which policy issue or specific pieces of legislation you want to cite that have had a great impact on ameliorating such issues?
So my number one issue remains the same as to the original reason why I ran for office, which was to expand access to healthcare services in Georgia. There's too many Asian Americans across the state, but particularly around the South, who lack access to healthcare. And of course, within the Asian American community, as diverse as it is, there are certain ethnic groups that that disparity is larger than others. But in Georgia, we have such a structural challenge when it comes to having one of the highest uninsured rates in the country that it exacerbates all of the other healthcare challenges that we're experiencing, which of course impact every other aspect of our lives. So for example, we have the third highest uninsured population, more than 500,000 Georgians who don't have access to any kind of healthcare coverage. What that results in is not people getting care, but people going to the emergency room, right? People having to wait and essentially their health deteriorating to the point in which it gets so bad that they have no other choice but to go to the emergency room, whether they can afford it or not. What that then results in is a massive amount of uncompensated healthcare costs, in which under federal law, if you go to the emergency room, you have to be provided services. But if you don't have healthcare coverage, again, it results in billions of dollars every single year just in the state of Georgia, in which there are healthcare expenses that are not being paid for by either private health insurance or public insurance. Who then has to bear that cost? It's at least two or three different entities. But one, hospitals primarily, if they don't have those costs covered, end up shutting down. Right? We saw, for example, Wellstar in the city of Atlanta, one of the few trauma one hospitals in the region, shut down. More than half of the hospitals in rural Georgia are financially unstable because of how much uncompensated care we have because of the high uninsured population. So that's one of the areas in which we're seeing a harmful impact of those uncompensated healthcare costs. Who else bears those costs? It's people with private insurance. One of the drivers that increases the premiums of anybody who does have, health insurance are again those uncompensated healthcare costs, right? Which everybody else has to then bear, which makes everyone's healthcare costs more expensive. All of that to say, to focus a little more on the specific healthcare challenges that we're experiencing that impact the Asian American community, but I think all of the communities in Georgia, we have one of the highest maternal and infant mortality rates in the country, meaning that the state of Georgia is one of the most dangerous states for a woman to have for a pregnant woman to have a child. Despite all the political rhetoric you hear about, the importance of life and these efforts to ban abortion because of life, the facts don't otherwise say that, right? The actions from the majority party, particularly when it comes to pregnant mothers, do not support that. In all aspects are we supporting the lives of women and children, especially given the high rates of mortality that exists. In my professional capacity, and this may not touch too much on the Asian American community, though tangentially it likely will, but it's the HIV/AIDS epidemic, in which in the South we have one of the highest new rates of diagnoses of HIV and AIDS, a disease that has killed millions of people around the world. Despite the fact that we're home of the CDC, particularly within the Black community, it's very prevalent and detrimental. But again, these are health challenges, epidemics, and even going back to the COVID pandemic, in which if we invest in our healthcare system as a state in everybody's healthcare, we improve our health and make ourselves safer and create an opportunity for all of us to thrive in the state of Georgia, which again, we have to make those investments as we proceed.
Yeah. And personally, I completely agree. I think that healthcare and accessibility to all types of medical resources, to things, making sure that we're prioritizing such high maternal mortality rates, even in our own state, and combating that should really be an issue that we're prioritizing. And another issue I really wanted to talk about was voting rights, especially as we've seen in Georgia, recent legislation that's put heavy restrictions on absentee and mail in voting. I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on legislation we're thinking of to protect voter rights, and how successful do you think they can be?
Absolutely. Excellent question. So, during the 2020 election, where we saw a surge in Asian American political participation, I think literally we saw a 200-fold increase. A large part of that was because of utilization of absentee ballots, or, mail-in ballots. It made sense, of course, in which amidst the worst public health crisis, during the time of a global pandemic, that folks wanted to still participate in a critically important election, um, but to do so in a safe manner. Asian Americans who utilized that method of voting, I think many were dismayed. In which, what was the reaction of the majority party in the state of Georgia after we saw such historic turnout and such excellent participation, which I hope all of us want to encourage? We saw incredible restrictions imposed on mail-in voting, some of which really had nothing to do whatsoever when it comes to election integrity, but clearly was more of barriers to serve as impediments to simply accessing the ballot. As an example, one of the changes that I just found so unnecessary was to simply request an absentee ballot from the state of Georgia. You have to print off a piece of paper, you have to have a wet signature, and then you have to send that back in just to request an application for an absentee ballot or for a mail-in ballot. It's ridiculous, even for someone, for an older millennial, but someone who's technologically savvy with a printer and all that kind of stuff. It can take a lot of time and effort. For older Asian Americans, where not only may they not have access to the technology or just a printer, but may also be facing language barriers when it comes to access of the ballot box. The only other way in which they could then participate is to potentially wait in line. And of course, in Gwinnett County, the most diverse county where we have a lot of Asian Americans living, in the 2016, 2018 election cycles, we saw the lines range from 4 hours to 8 hours, which again was completely unacceptable. Which only again imposes barriers that makes it that much more difficult for Asian Americans and for new citizens to vote and to participate. Now, in the legislature, there have certainly been a lot of efforts to improve and to make it easier to vote. I know, for example, a few years ago, one of the big initiatives that I was working on was, especially for election security purposes, to move toward hand-marked paper ballots, which are really kind of closer to utilizing absentee ballots or mail-in ballots, which I know about, I think, 8 to 10 different states, bipartisan states, some Democrat, some Republican led, on the West Coast utilize in order to run all of their elections. Not only is that more secure, in which it's that hand-marked paper ballot that serves as a gold standard for election integrity, again, it expands access in which folks don't have to wait in line. And certainly for Asian Americans who may have a small business or who are working tirelessly around the clock, that they can also cast their vote and have their say in our election. We'll continue to advocate and fight for a lot of those measures, but at least in the state of Georgia, where we remain under complete Republican control, in which it's a Republican who holds the governor's mansion, along with Republican majorities in the state Senate and the state House, more likely than not, at least my experience in the 7 years I've been in the legislature, is that we are likely not to see any new changes that will make it easier to access the ballot box. Because unfortunately, for the majority party, it is not in their interest to make it easier to access the ballot box. And because of some of the rhetoric that their base, the majority party's base, has been consumed with, they've made it essentially impossible to do anything but make it harder to vote based on concerns regarding election integrity. The other concern that came about as a result of SB 202, which was this big election bill that was passed after the 2020 election in Georgia, as a result of such massive political participation amongst Asian Americans and other communities of color, was the ability to allow a single individual to file an unlimited number of challenges in which Asian Americans, for example, their ability to vote could be challenged, and they could potentially be precluded from voting in an election. We're still dealing with those challenges and the ability for people to file an unlimited number of challenges. But for example, in Gwinnett County during the 2022 election cycle, I think there are about 50 to 60,000 voter challenges that were filed that took up an enormous amount of time from election workers, that distracted them from doing their job of trying to preserve and maintain election integrity, ultimately driven by conspiracy theory and fear that immigrants were coming in, or people were voting twice, or dead people were voting, or whatever conspiracy theories is driving some of these policies, ultimately, again, to the detriment of real people having an opportunity to participate in our election system. And so it's a critically important issue and subject, but we have a lot of work to do.
Yeah. And I think all these restrictions on voting, it hasn't necessarily, now at least in the state of Georgia, become about preserving the integrity of elections, but rather to serve certain political interests, or even like as political strategies to preclude Asian Americans or certain demographics or marginalized communities from voting certain ways. And that kind of feeds on to my next question, which is a little bit more of an opinion, but how big of a role do you think that Asian American and Pacific Islander voters play amidst the upcoming 2024 election cycle, both on a state level and national?
I think we play a critical role at the federal, state, and local level, across the board. I think Asian Americans, so long as they use their power and use it appropriately, we have an opportunity to really move our state and our country forward in a way in which we are living up to our highest American values of, first and foremost, protecting our democratic government, which is our freedom as citizens to govern ourselves by having the power to elect our leaders at all levels of government. But two, again, we have to know our own history as Asian Americans going back 150 to 170 years ago, in which, what is our trajectory? I think so many Asian Americans, myself certainly included, we are disconnected from some of the longer history that exists on the West Coast in particular, of Asian American civic organization and coalition building that was necessary to ensure their place in this country as citizens. So many, I mean, even if you look at like birthright citizenship, there are so many Supreme Court cases that define citizenship, that are in and around immigration, that were led by Asian Americans, that we had no idea of. Certainly myself, growing up in Georgia, didn't really have an understanding of that rich history because of the Chinese Exclusion Act, where imposed in the 1920s and 30s and expounded upon, imposed racially discriminatory quotas, which weren't wholly removed until the Immigration Nationality Act of 1965, in conjunction with the civil rights movement. And so you see with immigration from Asian countries, this nadir, right? This low point in which, again, there's a break of all the, immigrants from Asia coming in the late 1800s, early 1900s, to the more recent waves of immigration, whether it's from the Vietnam, whether they're Vietnamese refugees or from the Korean War. My family came to the state of Georgia, for example, like in the early 80s. And so, if we don't know our history, if we don't know the long legacy of all the Asian American leaders who fought for our rights, because that's part of the story of this country. It's part of the progress and freedom of this country, which is to expand rights for all. That's what progress really is about in America, in which uh, America looks more fuller, in which Asian Americans, Hispanics, Black people, we can all fully participate in this country, even though at its origin point, it was only white male landowners, people with property who could engage and vote in the first place, right? But in knowing that history, right, we then have that opportunity to, vote for the leaders and candidates and the party that best reflects what we know is that long trajectory, right? We have to be wise in knowing our history to make sure that ourselves and our communities that we're voting on the right side of history, that will help move our country forward, that will help move our state forward. And again, we have to use what power we have, and we have to know our history to be able to do those things.
Yeah. And I think, especially on history, that's a really important point because we see certain states, not just in Georgia, but like trying to exclude the teaching of like Asian American history or African American history. And I think in order to make informed decisions about civic engagement, about who we're electing as our political leaders, we have to really embrace and teach that history to our youth. Otherwise, there's no way we can make progress without looking back at our history.
I completely agree.
Yeah. So, Representative Park, seeing you work so tirelessly for Georgians and the Asian American community has been a really big inspiration to youth, not only like me in Georgia, but also nationwide. So, I want to leave off this interview by having you give some words of advice for Asian American youth in politics. So, first, what advice or insight do you have for AAPI youth who may be inspiring to enter politics or civic engagement?
I would say rise up and lead because we need you, right? Our democracy, it requires participation, and despite the political instability that we're going through, and we're going through an incredibly challenging period of time. Ultimately, I think this is an opportunity for us to emerge stronger, and that requires the next generation of Asian American leaders not to try and tune out, given how challenging it is. And it is very challenging because it's not just the political instability, it's all the other unprecedented threats and challenges that we're experiencing, from climate change to the acceleration of technology and AI that's causing economic disruptions. We have to lean in order to ensure that we have a seat at the table to help navigate the challenges that we're experiencing. And part of that is, especially for children and grandchildren of immigrants, we have to demonstrate that this is our home, right? We have to demonstrate a sense of ownership and empowerment in which this is our country, and because it's our country, we have an opportunity to help shape it into what we believe it should be and can be. So, I would encourage again, the next generation of Asian American leaders, yourself included, lean in, take care of yourself because again, this is a very difficult period of time. But do everything you possibly can to know that you belong here, and that you have every right and every opportunity to serve and to lead, and our country will be much better off for it.
Thank you so much, Representative Park, for taking the time to come here today, but also for all the work you have done and continue to do for Georgians, for the Asian American community, for youth like myself. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.